Tom and I are going to talk about cryptocurrencies, and we're going to use Bitcoin, which is the first one, the most significant one, as our main example. And we're gonna give you we're gonna educate you on it, and also give you some views of why some of the things we think cryptocurrency has some really good features that could carry it to a really great future, and also some of the risks involved. And we'll try and be a little nuanced and balanced with it. Tom has always been a crypto bull, and I've been a little more neutral on it. Okay, and actually, Tom's the one that introduced me to cryptocurrency about 7 to 8 years ago. And I've had Tom as a guest speaker in my own classes to talk about cryptocurrency. And I believe, it's important for my students and for everyone to know about different avenues of investing in it, some of the pros and cons of it, just as another choice. And again, we're not trying to push you to invest one way or another. I always try to be as neutral as possible, but hopefully with this, we'll educate you a lot, and we look forward to answering a lot of your questions. So Tom's going to begin by giving us a brief history of Bitcoin. Then we're going to start talking about how Bitcoin fits into the category of money and some of the pros and cons of it. So Tom, why don't you begin with a quick history of Bitcoin?
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Sally, for inviting us this evening, and welcome out, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. So let's give you a little bit of a history lesson, and then we'll try and fill in the gaps. In the 1980s, as early as the 1980s, as computer bulletin boards started to become more popular, some of you may be old enough to remember CompuServe or Prodigy or AOL as sort of forerunners of the internet. As early as that, people were talking about the need for electronic money. There was a group of people who called themselves cyberpunks. You may have heard of that term. And within that cyberpunk community, there was talk of a need for e-currency or digital currency. But nothing really happened, although there were a couple of attempts early on. Nothing really stuck. In 2008, a person who goes by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto put a white paper online describing how cryptocurrency could work and how it could use strong encryption as the basis for trust within the ledger. And that's really important as we talk throughout the night, that you understand sort of why, if I send you money or you send me money, we can trust each other on opposite sides of that transaction without knowing each other. So there's been a long-standing problem in mathematics called the Byzantine generals problem. And what the Byzantine generals problem says is that if I don't know you and you don't know me, how can we coordinate our actions? And it goes back to Byzantine generals who didn't know each other and didn't trust each other. But if any of those three generals individually had attacked the city, they couldn't prevail. But if they could coordinate their actions, then they could prevail collectively. But how could they trust each other? The answer to that question for literally 2,000 years was to get a trusted third party. The mafia calls it the consigliere, right? The person who's the go-between between the families. But that has always been the answer. And you may not even realize it, but you participate in that. When you go to Best Buy and buy something with a Visa card, and you go in and you pick up a $2,000 television set, and you walk out of Best Buy and all you did was show them a piece of plastic, that's really strange when you think about sort of fundamentally just what happened right there. They let you walk out with something of value, and all you did was sort of give them a piece of plastic. But what really happened was a third party, Visa, said, you may not know Tom Flake, but we're going to make sure you get paid. Right? And that's that trusted third party. And that's been the answer literally for thousands of years. And the single big innovation of cryptocurrency was this idea that we could share a ledger, and strong encryption would ensure that what that ledger documents is in fact truth. Right? And so that was the basis of the white paper. And so moving forward, what happened was a group of developers got together and they said, I think this is a good idea. And they developed the code around that, and they put that into the wild, if you will. And some people started to use Bitcoin, and some people started to mine Bitcoin. And we'll talk more about mining here in a few minutes and what that is and what that means. But the first sort of significant transaction that anybody, to my knowledge, documented was somebody bought a pizza. And they bought a pizza for several thousand Bitcoin. And because at that point, I think Bitcoin was valued at about a penny a piece. And, you know, pizza might be 14 or 15 bucks. So they spent 15,000 Bitcoin on that. And that at that point in time, Bitcoin, 14 or 15,000 Bitcoin was worth one pizza. Fast forward 10 years from now, from that to about 2018, and you could buy 2 Pizza Hut franchises for the amount that fellow was spent on a pizza. So it increased in value somewhat from that point forward. So from 2008 to 2018 was this period of rapid growth and adoption, and we'll talk about some of the milestones along the way. One of the first big milestones, and you may remember this if you're in the kind of financial industry, it was kind of a big deal. If you weren't, if you were just living your life, you might not be aware of it. But the country of Greece uses a form of currency called the lira. And they were being forced to pay back debt that they incurred to the World Bank and to the European Bank. And they were being forced to do such in such a way that they were printing a lot of the Greek lira to pay off that debt, which devalued the Greek lira. And so the Greek people responded in what you would think is a rational way. People in the finance industry would call it hedging, but they took their money and they put it into Bitcoin. Essentially, they used Bitcoin as a strategy to protect themselves from the risk represented by their national currency. And you might say to yourself, well, Tom, that happened in Greece. It could never happen anywhere else. So I'm going to show you something that I think is instructive. This is a Yugoslav $50 trillion note, because at one point the country of Yugoslavia had printed so much of their money that they devalued it to a degree that's bordering on absurd. But Argentina did the same thing not nearly as long ago. And you might say, well, okay, so that could only happen to third world countries. It could only happen to Greece or Yugoslavia or Argentina. It would never happen to a first world country, except about 7 years ago, Britain decided to vote itself out of the European Union. And when they did that, it was called Brexit. Nobody knew what was going to happen to the euro, and no one knew what was going to happen to the pound sterling, because when Britain voted themselves out of the European financial union, they could no longer use the euro, or they chose not to use the euro any longer, and so they had to revert back to the pound sterling, and no one knew what the value of the pound sterling was at that point. And the same thing essentially happened. The people of the United Kingdom of Great Britain said, you know what, we don't know what the risk of holding our national currency is going to be. We're going to buy Bitcoin. And in doing so, that wasn't just an effect that had an effect on Britain. And this is really, I think, where it's important to note, this isn't an isolated incident in terms of when something happens in Britain, it doesn't affect anything else. Or when something happened in Greece, it doesn't happen affect anywhere else. Because we're in America and we trade on the dollar, it couldn't possibly affect us, except there's a limited supply of Bitcoin. There will only ever be 21 million of them. And because of that, if you remember your basic economics, supply and demand, when the demand for something goes up, when the people of Greece demand more Bitcoin, when the people of Britain demand more Bitcoin, when the people of Argentina demand more Bitcoin, the price and value go up everywhere. So even though we in the United States didn't vote for Brexit, the cost of Bitcoin as denominated in dollars, the value of Bitcoin went up. I hope that makes sense to everybody. But supply and demand is a really important concept when you talk about cryptocurrency. When we talk about what we think the price of cryptocurrency may do in the future, that's one of the really important things, is to understand what's going on with the supply, and therefore how that might affect the price. So now we're into about the period of 2000 and, well, let's talk about one other thing first. Let's talk about the mining process. So mining is, Andrew and I take our computers and we set them to work on a very difficult mathematical problem. And whoever solves that problem first gets rewarded with more Bitcoin. And then let's say that not just Andrew and I, let's say Ali and TC want to participate as well. So now 4 of us are mining. There is a finite amount of Bitcoin issued every 10 minutes. It's measurable, it's knowable. I can tell you 110 years from now how much Bitcoin there will be. And because of that, because we know the sort of introduction rate, we can make very, very confident financial predictions in that respect as far as how much Bitcoin there will be. Conversely, I can't tell you how many dollars there are going to be in the market next month. So throughout this, I might talk a little bit about, I'm not trying to be pejorative toward the dollar or pejorative toward the Federal Reserve, but what I want people to understand is through the course of this discussion tonight is what's really going on with our banking system and our financial system. Because TC mentioned something before we started tonight, it was that he feared cryptocurrency. And I said, well, Bitcoin's worth about as much now as it was 12 months ago, but the price of eggs in dollars is about double. So at least as far as eggs go, the dollar's been much riskier than Bitcoin. So the mining process is this race to solve this problem, this mathematical problem. And whoever solves it first gets the reward. When Bitcoin started, the reward was 100 Bitcoin every 10 minutes. 4 years later, it got cut in half to 50. That was in about 2012. 4 years later, it got cut in half to 25. That was in about 2016. 4 years later, it got cut in half to 12 and a half, to 12 and a half. And next year, predictably, in about June, and I say about, it'll be the middle of June, plus or minus a couple days, the issue rate of Bitcoin will go down from 12 and a half to 6.25. Now, if I were to say to you, let's forget about cryptocurrency for a minute, let's just talk about gold. Let's say that predictably, the rate of the discovery, extraction, and refinement of gold were to be cut in half next year. What would you expect the price of gold to do? And that's sort of how we think about the price of Bitcoin, right? Is this whole supply and demand dynamic. The only difference is I don't know what the extraction and refinement of gold is going to be next year, but I know with great predictability what that's going to happen with Bitcoin, right? So that takes us all the way up to current, and that I hope explains mining in a way that you guys get. If you don't, please ask questions in the chat. We'll go ahead and try and address them as we go through things tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn time over to Andrew, and you can remind me of anything I forgot, Andrew.
Okay, sounds great. Great introduction, Tom. And yeah, one of the things I want to point out to the mining, the reason why it's set up for miners to mine Bitcoins, because what the miners do is solve the mathematical problem to make sure that the block is, they add a block. So in other words, that solves the double spend problem. And in other words, when people, if I send 10 Bitcoin to Tom, right? That has to be verified by miners. Miners will solve this problem to verify it and put it on the blockchain. And it's decentralized. There's thousands of miners or more all over the world doing this, so it can't be controlled. So in other words, the miners take the role away from the central bank of that third party. That solves the problem of having to have, you know, the central bank or the government be the third party, or Visa in the case of a credit card, right? It solves that problem, and it avoids the problem of government being, you know, ruining things by spending too much or so forth, because Bitcoin supply is limited. Now we're going to go into using this example of money with Bitcoin to kind of explain it in a very thorough and systematic way. So what I'm going to do is we're going to look at what makes money good, right? Why we have money. And the first thing is the medium of exchange, right? Whether it's a Visa card, whether it's US dollars, or, you know, you can use it to buy other things. And cryptocurrencies can be used the same way for goods in exchange. And in time, this will get better. Right now, there's certain merchants that accept Bitcoin directly. There's other merchants that don't accept it directly. So you might have to exchange Bitcoin to buy something else. That will increase. So right now, it's not a perfect medium of exchange, but it's growing, and there's more and more things you can buy directly with Bitcoin. And the transactions can be conducted securely and efficiently without a third-party verification, because of the miners verifying the transactions. And one more thing, I just want to make sure, even the very basic thing of Bitcoin, there's no coin. Bitcoin isn't like a physical thing, right? It's simply a series of numbers. It's a long, long code that only you get when you own that, all right? And if I send Bitcoin to Tom, then Tom has a new code generated that only he has. And that's the security of it, just to be clear on that. So again, Bitcoin is nothing physical. It's simply a series of numbers, or that's randomly generated, that it's almost impossible to steal someone's, unless you hack it. That's a whole other issue. Let me move on with that. All right, now, one of the big things that for money is, a store of value. And certainly cryptocurrencies can serve as a store of value. Now, of course, and I'm going to show you some charts and some of the volatility, their value can certainly fluctuate a lot due to market dynamics, supply and demand, right? And in this case, though, supply is relatively stable for cryptos. So it's the demand that changes, right? Whereas the US dollar and other currencies, a lot of times the supply is more of a driving force, as I'll show you, all right? And, the lower volatility. Now, Bitcoin, because it's the biggest and the most used, it generally has lower volatility than some of the other cryptocurrencies. Now, here's another strong case for using Bitcoin as a store of value, is that we know that the US dollar is going to continually lose purchasing power over time because there's inflation. As a matter of fact, if you know, but the Fed has a mandate that generally their target rate of inflation is 2%. So if things go really well, your US dollar will, whether you're buying eggs or gasoline or whatever, if everything goes perfectly, eggs are going to be 2% more expensive every year. Gasoline's going to be 2% more. That's if everything goes perfectly. All right. And we'll talk about what's happened recently. We know in 2022, we had inflation that was approaching 10% in the United States. In other countries, it could be much, much higher. We've had hyperinflation, which I'll get into some examples. All right, so now let's look at the volatility of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin hit an all-time high in November 10th of 2021 of over $68,000. And right now it's trading in 27,000 range, between 2720 to 7,500. And that's a drop of approximately 60% from the top, okay? So right there, think, whoa, I don't want to own something that loses 60%, okay? But if you look at it from an all-time low, and Tom said it might have been the pennies, I look back, let's just say if you bought Bitcoin in 2010 at 5 cents, okay, if you bought $100, you invested $100 in Bitcoin in July 10th, it would now be worth over $55 million. So despite the 60% drop off, it's had a spectacular gain over time. And again, I want to be clear, past performance is not indicative. We don't know that it's going to keep going up, but I just want to put it in perspective of the history of it, all right? Now, this is a chart showing Bitcoin's price, simply Bitcoin's price over time. And you could see, it basically gradually went up, and you could see this is when it hit this, $68,000 mark and had some crazy volatility and went down, all right? So if you look at it on a total number, it looks incredibly volatile, all right? But if we look at it, and this is the way Tom and I would look at it, when I look at it, this is why I would look at the stock market too, or any other thing over the long run. I look at it on what's called a logarithmic chart, or a percentage change chart. In other words, obviously, from Bitcoin to go from a few cents to 27,000, those numbers were ridiculously scaled. So now I'm looking at it as a percentage change chart. And if you look at it, you can see the incredible hyperbolic run up here between 2010 and 2014. And since then, though, the percentage change has leveled off. It still can move, but the percentage change has been leveling off. And so Bitcoin is becoming less volatile. And again, it might be way too volatile to a lot of people, and that's fine, but the volatility is declining. Now, let's compare Bitcoin to some other assets. So what I did was, and this is the same percent change or logarithmic graph, okay? So Bitcoin's in white, and this is the percent change. And I'm looking at it over the last 5 years in this case, and I'm comparing it to, in blue, first the S&P 500, if you invest in the stock market. And so over the last 5 years, you can see overall, Bitcoin is definitely more volatile than the stock market, all right? But it's also at a higher return. So over the last 5 years, the price of Bitcoin or the investments a little more than tripled. The S&P 500's gained a little over 50%. XAU is gold. Okay, gold is in the orange. Gold really hasn't done much. Gold's been more stable. It's also up about 50% over the last 5 years. And this is the price of oil I put in there. Now, interesting, oil had the craziest pattern. I don't know if you remember during COVID, but at one point, oil futures actually went negative and people were having to pay people to take away their oil. So oil can be pretty volatile also, all right? And now I want to show this in a longer term perspective. So now I'm going, excuse me, next slide. Here we go. So now we're looking all the way back from 2010, again, Bitcoin in white versus, the other assets. If you invest in the S&P 500, you would have made over 3 times your money, which is great. Gold, you'd be up about almost 70%. Price of oil over this period has actually gone down a little bit. But, Bitcoin has gone up over 5.26 million times. Okay, so the gain has been astronomically high. And now, if you think about this, this is kind of crazy. As Tom mentioned, Satoshi put this white paper and people started creating something, nothing physical. They created this idea, this concept with a white paper, and people started using, you're basically mining it and transacting in this kind of, this code that they used. And this code now, 1 Bitcoin went from a few cents to over 1.68 thousand, over $27 per Bitcoin now. And that's pretty incredible, the gain of it. And so certainly there's been a lot of use and a lot of people buying it and, over time, and it's becoming more and more in the mainstream. And the other thing about it, and we'll talk about some of the risk of it, but the more that it's used, the more merchants use it, the more that people get involved with it, the safer it becomes. So interesting, Bitcoin is a lot safer now at 27,000 than it was when it was 5 cents, right? When it was 5 cents, no one even knew if it would use it. So we'll see. And it's been around now for 12 years, over 12 years. So anyway, so it's becoming, the longer it's around, the safer it will become to look at. Let me continue onward with this. All right, now let's look at one of the strong points for buying a currency like Bitcoin, right? There are plenty of situations where certain countries have hyperinflation. And so we're in the United States, despite, this, and I'll show you where our Fed has kind of done a job to increase our money supply and create inflation. We haven't had hyperinflation in the United States, certainly not since the 1970s. But in other countries like Venezuela in 2016 had an inflation rate of 274%. It went up to over 860% in 17. And then it went crazy, just like in Yugoslavia, Tom mentioned, 130,000%, all right? So now in countries like Venezuela, obviously cryptocurrencies serve a great purpose because they can't trust their government. Their currency is basically worthless. I mean, Tom showed a $5 trillion bill that's worth nothing, right? So for these countries, it makes great sense for them to put their money in cryptocurrencies rather than their own currency. And that creates demand. Again, supply of Bitcoin is relatively fixed. It's very small growth. So this can kind of drive higher price of Bitcoin. So they can, and again, the big thing is that their limited supply and decentralized nature can provide protection because there's no one out there that can go out and say, oh, we need to put more Bitcoin in circulation. Let's go from 21 million to 50 million or something. It cannot be done because it's decentralized. And what decentralized means, again, there's thousands and thousands of people on the network. Everyone would have to agree to that, and that's not going to happen. So it's limited supply. So it can prevent against hyperinflation in cryptocurrencies. Tom, anything you want to add to the points I'm making that I missed?
So the one thing I think that's an important point to take away from this is that cryptocurrency is not an isolated American story. It is a global story. And so when we talk about things happening you in the economy, you have to think about whether that thing, whatever it is happening in the US and is a US effect, and what will its impact on Bitcoin be? Or is it a global effect, and what will its impact be? So we could talk about Venezuela for a second. People were there when inflation happens like that. You can't earn enough money, and your savings gets wiped out in value. So if you've saved all of your life and you've saved $1 million, today that $1 million will buy X. But when you have 130,000% inflation, like they did in Venezuela in 2018, suddenly your life savings of $1 million will buy about $10 worth of products, of goods and services. And that is mind-boggling to people that could even happen. But Venezuela is not a unique example. In fact, the stability of the American dollar is more the exception than the rule. So I don't know if that's helpful, Andrew.
Right. No, that's good. We're going to talk about some of the advantages of cross currency. And the US dollar is considered, by the way, a safe currency. A lot of people buy treasury bills and other things as a safety. They also buy gold. And so in the past, a lot of people in countries that are hyperinflation would convert to US dollars or gold or things like that. So they don't have to buy Bitcoin, in other words, but it's just another option that can help them. Okay. So just to be clear, it's not like, everyone in Venezuela is going to buy Bitcoin. A lot of them might buy gold, buy US dollars, wherever it might be. But Bitcoin's another good option. All right. So again, the big thing is the limited supply. So, and just to give you some numbers, right, to create scarcity, just like gold, gold is hard to mine. That's one of the things that led gold to kind of increase in value over time. It's very hard, very expensive to get. And that's kind of how they set up Bitcoin with, instead of anything physical, it's computer mining, right? It's figuring out these complex math equations and so forth. And right now, Bitcoin's current supply is 19.37 million. There's 19.37 million Bitcoin created out there, all right? And that's up about 1.75% from a year ago. Now, the maximum supply, no matter what happens, it can never go above 21 million. So the growth rate from the halving and everything else is going to slow. So every year, the growth rate of Bitcoin will slow, all right? And so the supply is relatively, the supply growth is smaller, and that will that will prevent from getting hyperinflation on Bitcoin, right? Where Bitcoin becomes devalued a lot. So what's driving the Bitcoin is the demand side. Higher demand is going to push the price up, lower demand is going to push the price down, all right? And now, some of the Bitcoin bulls like Tom, okay, they compare the market cap of what's out there in Bitcoin. What is all the Bitcoin worth right now? And the total market cap of Bitcoin right now at a price of 27,000 chain is right around $530 billion, okay? The total market cap of gold is approximately $13 trillion. So if you believe that Bitcoin, because in some ways it's a lot easier to hold than gold, right? It's not physical. If you believe that Bitcoin could kind of take the place of gold, then in theory, Bitcoin could go up, about 25 times to reach that $13 trillion mark. Okay, that's the bull case. I am not making any by the way, I'm not making prognostication. I'm saying this would be a bull case. Okay, it can also go down a lot too, but I'm just showing you this example. All right, right, Tom? Does that make sense?
It does. I would say that, though, if you believe that, well, let's reverse things for just a second. If you were to go back in time about 4 years ago, when Bitcoin was at $67,000 and gold was somewhat less than it is today, Bitcoin was actually equal to the world supply of gold in terms of value. So these things, it would not be incomprehensible for Bitcoin, the market cap of Bitcoin, to increase to parity back to gold, particularly because of its utility compared to gold.
Okay, so we'll see. We'll see what happens. All right. Now, I just want to show you, this is the US money supply, M1, I put a graph of it. And you can see that, the Federal Reserve and the US government, right, they have a self-interest, especially the US government wants as high employment as possible. They want people to work because they want to get voted in again, right? And the more they increase the money supply, the better it is for the economy, more people getting money. But it also creates inflation. Too much inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. So basically, they're increasing the supply of US dollars is what they're doing, which devalues it. And you can see that they raised it by, this is percent, so about 350% M1 growth, during this period when COVID hit, to make sure we didn't have a recession. And then we could see the effects of that. From the raise, we could see inflation rate shot up. So inflation went from near zero, right, during COVID, or before COVID. It was actually a really nice situation where inflation rate was right around 2%, which is their mandate. 2% was like the perfect Goldilocks scenario. But because they oversupplied with M1, they grew it too fast. Inflation shot up to about a little over 9%. And this is an annualized inflation rate. Right now, it's down a little under 5%. So it's going down the right way, although still a little bit high. So we'll see what happens. So even the United States, right, we can have inflation that gets too high, which is devaluing our dollar because, as Tom mentioned, now eggs are more expensive, gasoline is more expensive, et cetera. So, so that's just one of the negative externalities of the U.S. dollar.
Andrew, if I could interrupt you for a second.
Sure.
Mind going back for a second? I just want to explain to everybody what M1 is. That might be a wonky term for some folks that aren't sort of in our industry. And the M1 is the size or the measure of all of the physical money that's in circulation. So specifically what are in demand deposit accounts. So it's all the money that the Federal Reserve has printed. Yes, that's true. But there's a lot more money in circulation because of fractional reserve lending. Then there's a lot more money in circulation than the Federal Reserve has actually printed. And so what that means is if you added up all that money that was in circulation, all of the US dollars that were in circulation, that's what Andrew's talking about. So when you see that white line go up from a baseline of 0 all the way up to, I don't know, 8, something like that, that means that within that 2-year period, 3-year period, the Federal Reserve put approximately 800% more money into circulation than had been previously in circulation. And the reason they did that was they wanted to make sure that the market didn't lock up during COVID. There was plenty of what they call liquidity. But when they do that, there's way too many dollars chasing way too few goods. And that's what causes inflation, because suddenly people have more dollars and they're willing to part with them for that same egg.
Right, exactly. Thank you for adding that on. Great. All right. So now, here are some of the other advantages of cryptocurrencies, and we use Bitcoin as an example. The portability. So you can transfer across borders without significant restrictions. And so also, if you're if you're in the United States, you want to send money to family in Mexico or anywhere in Europe, in Ghana. My wife's from Ghana, or anywhere like that. It's very easy, okay, because it's the same. You don't have to worry about all these extra costs, and we're paying Western Union all these extra fees. The other thing is, there's a lot of countries that suddenly crack down on people, dissidents or whatever. And let's say you live, I'll just use China as an example, and you're a millionaire in China and you want to go to the United States. They won't let you leave. They might not let you leave with your money, your bank account, or your diamonds or gold. They might catch you at the airport and make you empty your pockets, right? But cryptocurrencies, they can't stop you from that because it's just a code that only you have. So no matter where you are, you have that money, that value. So that's a very, again, important thing, more so for countries outside of the US, or if you want to, bring it from US to somewhere else. So that's your money. It's not controlled by the government in any way. And again, that could be a positive externality if you're in a government that's cracking down, hurting your freedoms and things like that. So that's an important thing there. All right, that's a real positive. And then, divisibility. So Bitcoin can trade in fractions and up to basically 1 Bitcoin is divisible into 100 million. They call it Satoshis. Okay, so basically it's almost infinitely divisible. It's such a small number that you can trade it and buy something small or something large just as easily. In US dollars, divisible to pennies. Bitcoin is a lot more divisible. Gold, in theory, you could shave it off at a microscopic level, but that's very impractical. So gold, you have a gold bar, it's a lot harder to buy something small with it and shave something off of a gold bar, right, than Bitcoin. So it allows for price flexible transactions. So again, this is a nice advantage of any cryptocurrency, including Bitcoin. All right, and then durability. Now I'm going to talk about the good thing about the durability, and then also some of the risk on this. Okay, there's a downside to this. So obviously, look, if you have US dollars, even, the dollars could go bad. It could eventually wear, and you could tear it, you could lose it, and so forth, right? But obviously, as long as you have your code, Bitcoin, the encryption code, your Bitcoin will never be lost. However, if you lose your code, or you lose your computer or something, that you have a wallet, you potentially can lose your Bitcoin forever. No one can get it, including you. And there were stories of people who had bought a new computer and they had all this Bitcoin from 2010 that's worth millions of dollars, and they forgot to save their hard drive or whatever, and they've lost all that. So there's a lot. I don't know the number. Tom, do you have any idea about like how much Bitcoin's literally lost from this, or?
As far as how much is taken out of circulation, sort of the reduction of the M1 in Bitcoin, I don't have a firm number on that, but it's not an inconsequential amount. So
right.
Of the 19.3 million Bitcoin that have been mined, I would estimate only about a third of them are in active circulation. I don't know that the rest have been lost or if people are just holding on to them, but only about a third are in circulation.
God, okay. And so what Tom's saying is not just that it's lost, but some people just hold it in their wallets. They don't do anything with it. They're just holding it to store value, kind of like gold. If you took gold bars and put it in a safe somewhere, right? Same thing. And again, I guess I could mention that theoretically the storage cost of holding Bitcoin is almost zero, right? It's just your little computer, whereas storage cost of gold is a little bit higher because you've got to get a safe or whatever it might be. So it does have that edge. But because of the decentralized nature too, let's say you send Bitcoin to someone, right? You can't, that's it, they got it, right? So you got to make sure that you're sending it to the right person, okay? And you got to make sure you have your code. All right. And now the three other things that are simple: fungibility, uniformity, and cognizability, all right? So basically, the idea is that each unit can be traded or converted for another, just like US dollar. Every unit's identical. Tom's one Bitcoin is exactly the same as my one Bitcoin. It's uniform, same standard protocols, and they're uniquely recognizable. In other words, if I own a Bitcoin, my code is going to be unique to me. That means I know it. Tom's code will be unique to him. And then users can verify ownership on the blockchain networks. That's what the miners do. And by the way, that network for the miners is transferring. Whoever looks at the Bitcoin, it's open to everyone. You could see the whole blockchain. So you can't be cheated on that. Anything you want to add to that, Tom?
So this is actually one of those areas where it's really hard to get your head around this whole idea of that last point. Users can verify ownership and track transactions on blockchain networks, right? So every transaction that's ever been made in Bitcoin is available for review on the blockchain. Now, at this point, that runs to hundreds of gigabytes of data, but it's all there. So one of the early criticisms of Bitcoin was that, oh, it's anonymous. People could do illicit things with it and then no one would know. Reasonable criticism, maybe. The difference is that if I know Andrew's wallet, I can see every transaction in and out of that wallet since the beginning of the blockchain. Difference being that if Andrew and I are up to something illicit and I walk into his office with an attaché case full of $100 bills and then I walk out, that's completely untraceable, that transaction. So I would argue that Bitcoin is far less anonymous than other transactions. And in fact, that's one of the things that I'd like to point out to folks is I think you're going to hear more over the next year to year and a half of the Federal Reserve trying to issue an e-dollar, essentially a cryptocurrency competitor backed by the Federal Reserve. I'm of the opinion that that's a bad idea because while I don't mind my transactions being tracked on a public ledger, I really don't like the idea of the government tracking everything I do with my money. Not that I'm doing anything illicit. I just don't think the government should be in that business.
Okay, good point. All right. So now I'm going to kind of talk about, I'm going to kind of intentionally play kind of the role of a naysayer of Bitcoin, and Tom will defend it, and he'll defend it very well, I'm sure. But okay, so one thing I look at, Tom, if I buy a stock, I've got earnings, there's dividends, there's some real value there, okay? But these cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, there's no inherent or fundamental value. It's just a perception and belief. And so, how do I know that people, like, it can't be another tulip bulb craze? If people just say, hey, you know what, I'm onto something else. Instead of Bitcoin, I'm going to try something else, and then it has no more value. What's your argument for why it has real value for everyone?
So, well, let me argue first why the dollar doesn't have any real value. Okay, because I want to come at this from an even playing field, right? You showed a graph earlier that showed that the Federal Reserve on a whim could increase the amount of dollars in circulation by 800%, and no one anywhere has a say in that other than Jerome Powell. Okay, so it's called fiat currency for a reason. Fiat in Italian means I will. That means Jerome Powell wills that there be more money, and there is. It doesn't mean that we have a gold-backed dollar or anything else. There's nothing that backs the dollar other than the good faith and credit of the United States. So on one level, that criticism that you just talked about could be easily leveled against the US dollar. At the same time, we'll probably talk a little bit more about mining here as we go forward in time. And what I would say that in the mining process, particularly in what's called proof of work, which is what Bitcoin's modeled on, which is, some of the folks online are asking about environmental impact, and I know we're going to talk about that in a minute. But that environmental impact, that use of electricity, that use of mining computers, that use of capital and labor to produce a Bitcoin is actually what implicitly gives it money. If I'm a Bitcoin miner, and I have been, I at one point ran the largest mining operation in North America. When you're a miner, your largest cost is electricity. At one point, our electric bill was $1 million a month. We were the largest consumer of electricity, I think, other than maybe the federal government or Walmart in the state of Virginia in Dominion Enterprises or Dominion Power's territory. If you think your electricity bill is too high, I thought mine was way too high. But that being said, that's actually what gives Bitcoin money, is that I won't produce it if I can't produce it at a profit. And so I'm always making this assessment of whether or not I should be mining, whether I shouldn't be mining, whether I should be mining off peak, what my source of power is, whether it should be wind or solar or flare gas from natural wells or nuclear, which is in this case, we were running from Surrey Nuclear Power Plant. So that's a fairly green source of electricity in terms of no hydrocarbon emissions. So the miners are very conscious of their most significant input cost, which is electricity, and they're always trying to save on that. So we can talk about that, but the idea is that the costs associated with mining are what give it value. In the same way, by the way, that it is for gold. So for instance, if I'm a gold miner, forgetting about cryptocurrency for a minute, I have a cost in heavy equipment. I have a cost in labor. I have a cost in terms of power for extracting that gold and refining that gold. I won't mine it unless I can make a profit. And so always gold miners, forget about Bitcoin miners, are evaluating their ability to make a profit given the market conditions, and they're adjusting whether they're going to mine gold or not. So in real time, the amount of gold that's being introduced into the market is being adjusted in real time, very similar to how the value of Bitcoin gets adjusted depending upon whether miners are mining or not. I don't know if that's helpful or not. It might be too wonky, but that's the reality.
No, that's a good one. The other thing too, I'll add to about, one thing is I'm an environmentalist, and I looked at Bitcoin energy use, and I put some numbers up there, and it looks really, really high. But we do have to consider that usage is also saving in other ways. For example, if there's less use of banks with physical locations and paper, there's no paper. So all that 1,200 terabyte per hour usage isn't all incremental. There's some savings from other things, and there certainly is an incentive for miners, to Tom's point, to always be as efficient as possible, because that's their main cost. I just hope in the future, Tom, that they do that they find more efficient ways of doing it. And let me ask one without being too technical, but Ethereum switched from basically proof of work to proof of stake, and I believe they've made their calculations easier, so they are saving a lot of electricity.
Yeah.
Why not Bitcoin do that? And what's the reason they wouldn't? And how much energy would that save?
So while you've been speaking, I've been answering some of the questions in the chat room.
Okay.
And some of the questions have centered around this idea of, couldn't it be more environmentally sensitive? Couldn't you use less electricity? And the model that Ethereum has adopted is something called proof of stake. And it's got certain things that make it attractive. There's no question about it. The thing that I personally don't like about it is the difference between proof of work and proof of stake. Anybody that's online with us tonight could conceivably buy a Bitcoin miner, set it up in their house, power it up, configure it to use it on the internet, and they could be mining Bitcoin the next minute. It's very egalitarian. Anybody can participate. At the same time, if I want to participate in proof of stake, what happens is, as that mining occurs, Andrew has committed a certain amount of his Ethereum. I've committed a certain amount of my Ethereum. And when the reward comes out, it's given proportional to the amount of money, the amount of Ethereum that we have staked. That's what they call it, right? What that means in my parlance is that the rich get richer and the poor get poor, because there's no meaningful way for the poor to really participate in that means, or in that method of mining. So I'm a much bigger fan of proof of work, because essentially anybody can participate at whatever level. I mean, literally, you can buy a really world-class mining rig for about $2,400, $2,500 from some of the companies in China. And that's far more cost-effective to participate in a meaningful way, in my estimation, than proof of stake.
Okay, got it. Understood. So that's one of the downsides that we have to kind of deal with to make it fair, is that proof of work. Okay. Now let's talk about, I know there's probably some questions in the chat too, and I put it in here ahead of time. What about the bad actors? I know there was Silk Road where they used Bitcoin for hiring murderers and illicit drug deals and extort. And what about some of the things where someone hacks, a whole computer network, and then they want to be paid in Bitcoin, not US dollars, the whole Bitcoin ransom. Are we, what are we doing to prevent that so that we reduce the negative externalities? Or, tell us about that.
Well, okay, let's come back to that in a minute. But what does the Federal Reserve do to prevent you from buying drugs with dollars?
Okay, well, it's tracked. Well, you're saying cash dollars.
Is it tracked as efficiently as the blockchain?
Well, it's a little harder to come in with a big suitcase full of cash than it is to just send a code of Bitcoin.
So particularly across national lines. Yeah, I agree with you, Andrew. And I was just joking a little bit. So, yeah. But it's fair to ask the questions sort of in mirror images, because we ask those questions of something that's new simply because it's new, not because it's not equivalent or better, right? So in the case of, can people do bad things with Bitcoin? Yes. But can people do bad things with dollars? Equally, yes, right? And the dollars are truly anonymous, whereas Bitcoin has a blockchain that can be audited by people that have the right software. So I would argue that to do things illicitly on the blockchain is more traceable than it otherwise will be. I will give you a personal example. So about 4 years ago, I had 5 figures of money stored on my phone in terms of Bitcoin. And there was a ring of criminals who were targeting people who were prominent in the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency industry. A common friend of ours got hit. There was a very prominent friend of mine that you and I don't think you know, got hit. But essentially what happened was a fellow called AT&T and said, Tom Flake has died. This is at about 2 o'clock in the morning. And you need to switch his SIM card over to this SIM card. And he gave the person customer support my SIM card number. Now, when they do that, when AT&T transfers the phone, their phone becomes your phone. And you notice when you request to have a password reset, typically when you make that request, what happens? The way to do the password reset typically gets sent to your phone. And the reason they do this at 2 a.m. in the morning is because you're asleep and you don't know what's happening. So that next morning, my wallet had been cleaned out. My cryptocurrency wallet had been cleaned out. And I got hit for about 5 figures. A friend of mine got hit for well into 6 figures, if not 7 figures.
Wow.
And he ended up suing AT&T because their operators, if not actively participating, were at least culpable. That's all the bad side of it. The good side of it was that it crossed state boundaries, so it was a federal case and went to the FBI. And I was running a large Bitcoin operation full of IT people, and we did our own sort of forensics on it. We built the case as far as where the people were, when it happened, what IP addresses they were, et cetera. And we took that to the FBI and we said, here's who you're after. About 6 months later, we heard that the guy in Atlanta had been arrested, the guy in Philadelphia had been arrested, and a guy in Africa they didn't get to. But they found that chain. Now, they had spent our Bitcoin. I didn't ever get it back. I didn't sue AT&T for it, although I probably could have and should have. I got a nice letter from them apologizing. But the moral of the story is that people with some IT expertise can go a long way towards solving a crime that's not truly anonymous.
That's a good point. I've also heard back in the early days of Bitcoin, it was harder to check. Now they've gotten better at checking ledger, and they found some bad actors that have done things like 6-7 years ago for millions and millions of dollars, and they've caught them and gotten a lot of the Bitcoin back and put them in jail. So these people had spent all your Bitcoin, and you couldn't get it back, and because I wonder, could you track who they gave it to and so forth? You know what I'm saying?
You can do that, but what's the point? I mean, are you going to go after?
Yeah, so I see. It's
right.
Yeah.
At some point, it just becomes the squeeze isn't worth the juice in my case. Now, for the friend that got hit for about $1 million, it might be worth it for him. For me, I got hit for less than $20,000, so it's not.
Okay.
It's not as sort of the what you're going to put out to get it back is not really probably worth it.
So that's just another thing about one of the risks of holding Bitcoin. You could do it in a separate hard drive, or you can literally keep your code off your computer, and then no one can get to it. So there's different ways, but for the most part, it's it's pretty safe. So I think, Tom, see if there's anything else. One of the things I talked about, and Tom already alluded to, is how a lot of people consider Bitcoin like digital gold, because if you think about it, you've got to mine it. There's a cost to mining it, scarcity of supply. And, it's viewed as a hedge against hyperinflation, like we talked about, and so forth. Some people think it's similar to like the diamond market, diamonds. And I don't know if you know, but the diamonds weren't worth a lot until De Beers kind of created the whole demand for it. And, they gain value through perception of scarcity and the symbol of love and status. Now, a lot of, if a guy wants to marry a woman, he better buy her, right, a big diamond, I think worth what, like a year's salary or 6 months salary or something like that. De Beers did a great job of marketing it. Now diamonds are worth a fortune.
Salary.
How much? What is it, Tom?
I said I think it's 2 or 3 years salary. I suppose it depends on who you're marrying.
Yeah, exactly right. But so anyway, the point is that even though diamonds have little practical value and you could say low intrinsic value, certainly diamonds are worth a fortune, and their values continue to grow over time. So. Any final thoughts or add, Tom, before we open it to questions?
No, and in fact, there's a series of about 6 or so questions that have been asked in the chat room that I haven't had the chance to type into, and I'm hoping we can just address those sort of here now that we're in the Q&A section. Is that okay?
Yeah, let's do it.
So Richard asked.
This has been good. Hold on, we're at 8:05. Gentlemen, this has been really, really good. I got a bunch of notes. Well, first I'll say, Thomas, your Byzantine general problem, that helped me. Your example on Visa helped me. It really helped me. And Andrew, you helped me, right? Because I've been jotting down my questions as I went, because the store value versus using it as a currency, because of my limited, because of my lack of willingness to really dive in and kind of try, because it just seems so big to me, the whole crypto thing. So I just stayed away from it, stick with the S&P 500. I'm good. But I see all this news about crypto and I never dove in. But you really helped me, Andrew, because I thought I'm trying to figure out how can someone participate in this crypto thing as a currency at $26,000 a pop. You know, the average guy, how you gonna buy a candy bar? You know, how you gonna buy? But when you broke down the visibility, that helped me. So
Right.
I
You,
get it.
you could buy a fraction of it. So you can buy, you buy $100 worth, $200. That's one of the advantages
So
of
you
it.
could buy a stick of gum with it, right? Because
That
it's
helped me.
visible down
Right,
to
that
eight
helped
decimal
me.
places.
Good.
So, but where I'm still at, and I'll just kind of throw this out because I think I might even saw it. They were more isolated to the IRS, but one of the benefits of that you guys are talking about with crypto is just how I guess portable it is across borders, and just, you know, people can trade in it, individuals. But what's going to stop a government from laying down laws to say, you know, my citizens cannot? You cannot. I mean, what will stop a government from doing that? So, and if one did decide to do that, and I had no idea that even we were thinking of a e-dollar, right? Because now that makes me think it's even more likely that, you know, that it may become a deal where the government gets involved. But so what would stop a government from getting involved and trying to regulate crypto at some level that just changes this whole opportunity?
So let me give you an example outside of crypto for a minute, and maybe this will help, TC. In 2000, I think, or give or take 1999 or 2000, China decided that the free flow of information to its citizens would be incompatible with its goals of keeping them ignorant and under control. And they put up what was called at the time the Great Firewall of China. You may recall that term, and maybe you're not old enough because I'm an old man, and that was like 25 years ago. But here's what happened. When China put up the Great Firewall of China, it didn't stop the internet from progressing. It just meant that China became an internet backwater, and they couldn't participate in the internet, right? It's the same thing. So I believe countries that try and maintain their monopoly on a national currency that has, varying by countries, different types of flaws, will find themselves economically isolated, because there's some things you can do with cryptocurrency that really improve the performance of your financial system. So I'll give you one example. If you're Dell or you're Walmart and you source your products in China and then you ship them here, there's about a 90-day cash cycle. Okay, from the time you order something and you pay 50% to the time they document that it's been shipped and you pay another 50%. In business, it's really important what your cash cycle is, and that is how fast you're going from cash to a product to back to cash. Does that make sense?
It does.
Well, the ACH system and bank wires to add 3 to 10 days to that cash cycle. And if you're Walmart or Dell and you've got billions of dollars tied up in that cash cycle, 3 to 10 days is meaningful. If I pay with Bitcoin instead of ACH, I cut 10 days out of my cash cycle and make my cash cycle something like 15% more efficient. Okay. That's a really wonky answer for probably most of the people that are online. But if there are any CFOs online, they got that answer and they're like, holy crap, I got to be paying in Bitcoin.
Right, no, I get it. This is good. So we're at 8:09. I'm kind of nerded out, so I want to keep you going, but I'm going to stop. We got a bunch of questions, so let's see what we can answer, and I guess we'll hold on if you guys are willing. You know, another 15 minutes or so before we close out.
TC, I've been watching what's going on in the chat, and can I answer a few of these questions?
Please do. Absolutely.
By grouping them together. So Terrence asked, can you cash out Bitcoin for physical cash? And Carol asked, how does one purchase Bitcoin? And those are the same answers. So for instance, there are exchanges that exist. I happen to use Coinbase. I don't own Coinbase. I'm not a party to Coinbase. I just simply use their service. I'm not here to promote them over 15 other exchanges that you could use. But an exchange is very similar to, if you've ever gone to an airport and you trade your dollars for euros when you go to Europe, and then you come back from Europe and you turn whatever's left over in Europe back into dollars, that's exactly the function an exchange does for Bitcoin. So if you have your dollars, you can buy Bitcoin from Coinbase, and then you can spend them or save them as Bitcoin. And then when you choose to, you can turn them back into dollars. Now, like when you go through the airport and you turn your dollars into euros and you turn your euros back into dollars, there's a charge associated with both sides of that transaction, which adds some friction to the transaction. But it's only as you go from one sort of national currency to another that you experience that transaction. If I were to send you Bitcoin, there's very little in the way of transaction costs. Hopefully that answers Terrence's and Carol's questions. Anne asked about the IRS required Bitcoin transactions be reported on individual returns. That's true. You should understand that Bitcoin is taxed as an asset, not as an income. So there's a different tax rate that accrues to the appreciation or depreciation of assets. They're subject to long-term and short-term capital gains rather than just income tax. And so your mileage will vary. Talk to a tax advisor. Terrence asked, can you cash out Bitcoin for physical cash? I answered that question a moment ago. Anne said, yeah, I know people have cashed out and purchased cars, trucks, repairs on the house, etc. That's 100% true. Andrew and I both know a fellow who bought a Tesla about 5 years ago with his profits from Bitcoin. Zadis asked, what protections are in place to protect the average person using cryptocurrency, like if someone uses your credit card without your consent? That's actually a weakness of cryptocurrency that we haven't talked about. There is no FDIC. There is no Visa card per se, where if somebody takes my Visa card and they spend it, I'm only subject to the first $50 of liability. So for instance, Zetis, I told the story earlier about how somebody had stolen cryptocurrency from the wallet on my phone. I lost $19,000 and there was no Visa to make me whole. So that is a weakness of the system. Just to add to that, would the new FedNow system help with that? ACH, yeah, Richard, it may if you're in the United States. I don't believe FedNow is used for international remittance just yet, but I could be wrong on that. The pros and cons of HODL. For those of you that haven't heard the term HODL, it is hold on for dear life. One of the things that you should be aware of, that we said implicitly, but I'll now make it explicit, is that the Federal Reserve tries to make, in a good year, your dollars worth 2% less this year, next year than they are this year. And what that forces to happen, that we call that inflation. We accept it as a fact of life. But what that really means is that you are incentivized to spend your dollars today rather than save them for tomorrow. That's what inflation does. And they try and keep that motivation down to about 2%. And when it gets to 10%, they think that's crazy. We don't want people to spend that much of their money, because if you knew your $100 was only going to buy $90 worth of stuff next year, you'd buy the $100 worth of stuff this year. We could get into a whole net present value discussion, but that's the implicit incentive built into the dollar. Cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, has the exact opposite built-in incentive. Because of the scarcity and because of ever-increasing demand, it's almost certain that your Bitcoin next year is going to be worth more and able to buy more than it does this year. Now, have there been exceptions to that rule over the last 15 years? Yes, there have. But in general, you saw that chart that Andrew put up over 15 years. Bitcoin has been almost uninterrupted in its up and to the right sort of trajectory. So yes, there are setbacks, but HODL means hold on for dear life, because many people that adopt that philosophy are convinced that the Bitcoin they buy today will be worth a lot more 10 years from now than it is today. Sam said, what are you actually buying when you buy the capacity to do proof of work at home? You're buying a computer that's specialized in solving what's called the SHA-256 encryption protocol. There was a time 15 years ago when you could actually use your computer to mine Bitcoin, but the problems have gotten so hard that you need very specialized gear to solve the mathematical problems at a level of efficiency where you'll overcome the cost of electricity. And so those are built on very special IC chips, but that's the bad news. That answer sounded really technical. The good news is almost anybody can afford one of those computers, because there's companies online. Just go to eBay, go online and search for, I want to buy a Bitcoin miner, that you can buy them for. They're $2,000 to $3,000 to $4,000, and generally they will pay for themselves in about 9 or 10 months. So you can figure out the rate of return on The new regulations in New York impacting Bitcoin. It shouldn't surprise you that the center of banking would be the first to oppose Bitcoin through regulation. I don't see it having any long-term or lasting impact because places like Wyoming have passed in the last 5 years very attractive legislation toward Bitcoin. And while New York is the center of banking, they're not the center of the universe, and it's the Great Wall of China, in my estimation. In fact, New York passed very draconian anti-cryptocurrency legislation about 10 years ago, and then it got overturned and ignored and re-legislated, and likely will happen again. Alexander said, what's the best press to start with? Alexander, I'm not sure what you mean by press in that case. If you can reword the question, I'm happy to answer it. Richard said, do you see potential risk in the stablecoin such as Bitcoin when CBDC hits the exchange? I'm not sure what CBDC is. Andrew, can you help out with that? Is that central bank's digital currency, maybe?
Yeah, that must be central bank digital currency.
I don't know that I would say stablecoins such as Bitcoin. Bitcoin is not a stablecoin. Stablecoins in particular are cryptocurrencies that are issued against some currency that issuer claims to have in reserve. So I might have $1 million in reserve and I issue 1 million of whatever my stablecoin happens to be. I say claims to have in reserve because there's been some question as to whether all the stable coins out there actually have in reserve what they claim to have. But you should have on a one-to-one basis, whatever that thing you're putting in reserve, whether it be gold or dollars or whatever, against that cryptocurrency you're going to issue. Thank you, Myrna. I think it was all Andrew. I'm just trying to keep up. You heard how much better his resume is than mine. And thank you for the rest. I think everybody else was just saying thank you, and it was our pleasure.